San Quentin sits right on the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay, its walls rising over the water like a warning to anyone approaching. When it opened in 1852, California was barely a state. The gold rush was in full swing, crime was everywhere, and San Quentin was built in a hurry to deal with it. But it wasn't built with order. It wasn't built with safety. And it definitely wasn't built for the future. In the early years, the prison was run by private contractors, not the government. Guards were untrained. Cells were packed. Violence was constant. Inmates fought for scraps, slept on hard floors, and lived with the reality that each day might be their last. From the very beginning, San Quentin wasn't a correctional facility. It was a battlefield. And that foundation of chaos would shape everything that came after. As California expanded, San Quentin expanded with it, but not in a good way. More inmates were forced into cells designed for half their number. Gangs took hold, controlling entire tiers. The yard became a place where alliances meant survival, and mistakes meant death. For decades, the prison witnessed riots, stabbings, and violent power struggles. Guards patrolled catwalks knowing something could explode at any moment. Every corner had stories, escape attempts, assaults, and long stretches of brutality that went unreported. By the time San Quentin reached the 20th century, its reputation was cemented. It was California's deadliest prison, a place where punishment often went far beyond the sentence. San Quentin's violence wasn't its only problem. The buildings themselves were collapsing into the past. Much of the prison still relied on 19th century infrastructure. Pipes rusted until they snapped. Ventilation barely worked. Cells flooded during storms. And entire sections of the facility were condemned but still used because there was nowhere else to put inmates. Experts warned that San Quentin wasn't just old, it was dangerously outdated. The walls couldn't be modernized. The plumbing couldn't be repaired. And the tight spaces made disease spread faster than anywhere else in the state. But year after year, the warnings were ignored. San Quentin kept running, kept crowding, kept breaking down, until something finally forced the world to pay attention. In 2020, a deadly virus swept through California. Inside San Quentin, the impact was catastrophic. The infection reached the prison by accident, a mismanaged transfer. Within days, the virus spread through the poorly ventilated cell blocks. Inmates locked behind bars were exposed with no escape, no space, and no medical resources to fight back. The numbers grew faster than anyone imagined. Alarms rang all day. Bodies were carried out daily. Staff fell ill while trying to treat the sick. And the death toll forced the world to look directly at a truth California had ignored. San Quentin was not built to survive the modern world. Investigators later stated that the outbreak was not just tragic, it was preventable. It revealed every weakness the prison had hidden for decades. Suddenly, people asked, why is this place still open? Why is this still how California handles incarceration? The answers led to a decision that would change California history. After the outbreak investigation, the state made a stunning announcement. San Quentin, California's oldest and most dangerous prison, would be shut down, emptied, and transformed. Death row, the most infamous part of the prison, was dismantled. The execution chamber was permanently closed. Inmates were transferred to safer, more modern facilities. Entire wings of the prison were decommissioned. But the plan wasn't just to shut San Quentin down. It was to reinvent it. The state announced a complete transformation, from a punishment-focused prison into a rehabilitation center aimed at reducing crime and helping offenders rebuild their lives. This wasn't just structural change. It was ideological. And it marked the first time in California history that a maximum security prison was being redesigned for restoration instead of retribution. San Quentin's past had finally forced a different future. As the shutdown process began, San Quentin grew eerily quiet. The yard, once full of tension, now sat mostly empty. Workshops closed. Old cell blocks were cleared out. Guards began shutting doors that had been open for more than a century. For some, the silence was a relief. For others, it felt like the ghost of the prison was finally settling. The empty tiers told the story of everything California wanted to leave behind: overcrowding, neglected medical care, aging infrastructure, and a violent legacy that defined generations of inmates. San Quentin wasn't designed for rehabilitation. It wasn't designed for safety. And it wasn't designed for humanity. Its final days proved that the world around it had changed, but the prison never had. San Quentin's shutdown didn't happen overnight. Even after the announcement, thousands of people still lived and worked inside the crumbling walls. And the deeper investigators looked, the more problems they found, problems that had been ignored for decades. Entire sections of the prison were discovered to be structurally unsafe. Ceilings sagged. Walls showed stress cracks. Electrical wiring was decades outdated. Some cell doors didn't even lock properly anymore. Medical staff revealed that treatments were often delayed because the clinic was so overcrowded. Inmates waited hours, sometimes days, for basic care. And in a building meant to hold a few hundred, sometimes more than 1,000 men were packed into spaces smaller than a high school gym. For the first time, the public saw San Quentin not as a symbol of punishment, but as a symbol of failure. Still, life inside the prison continued, slow, tense, and uncertain. Inmates didn't know where they would be sent next. Guards weren't sure if they'd keep their jobs. Programs were shutting down one by one: educational classes, workshops, and job training. The prison became a shell of itself, balancing between two identities: the violent past everyone knew, and the uncertain future the state was promising. It wasn't the end of San Quentin's story. It was the beginning of a deeper unraveling, one that would reveal just how much had been hidden behind the prison stone walls. And the further investigators dug, the more shocking the truth became. As San Quentin moved toward closure, investigators began combing through decades of forgotten reports, maintenance logs, and internal complaints. What they uncovered went far beyond broken pipes and failing cells. It revealed a system that had been deteriorating from the inside long before anyone admitted it. Hidden in old storage rooms were boxes stuffed with documents, records of outbreaks that were never reported, violent incidents quietly buried, and medical emergencies that had been handled with shockingly little oversight. Inspectors found notes from staff who had begged for upgrades to basic safety equipment years before, only to be ignored, because the cost was too high or the issue was not critical. Some of the darkest findings came from the prison's most isolated units. There were reports of men kept in solitary confinement for months longer than recommended, living in cells where mold grew along the walls and the air barely moved. The prison's own staff admitted that the ventilation system was so weak that heat built up inside the cells like ovens during the summer months. Even the water pipes, many of them installed in the 1800s, were corroded so badly that some internal samples showed contamination. It wasn't enough to poison anyone outright, but enough to raise questions about how safe daily life had been for decades. Then came the revelations about overcrowding. San Quentin had been operating far beyond its intended capacity for years, forcing inmates into stacked bunks and converting storage rooms into temporary cells. Medical teams revealed that they were treating twice as many patients as they were staffed for, with equipment so outdated that some machines hadn't been replaced since the 1980s. The deeper investigators went, the more it became clear. San Quentin wasn't just behind the times. It was a relic from an era when prison conditions didn't matter. But the biggest shock to the public came from something hidden in plain sight. A group of architects and engineers concluded that San Quentin's layout made it nearly impossible to modernize. Its corridors were too narrow for emergency evacuations. Its cell blocks were stacked in ways that violated modern fire codes. And its foundational structure was so old that trying to rebuild on top of it could cause the entire building to collapse. It wasn't just dangerous. It was unfixable. Still, inside those failing walls, life continued. Inmates woke up to the same count, the same yard time, the same routines. But whispers moved across the tiers. Whispers that the end was coming, that transfers were starting, that entire sections of the prison were preparing to shut down for the first time in history. Some inmates welcomed the change. Some feared what came next. And many simply didn't believe it would ever happen. Because San Quentin had survived fires, riots, political battles, lawsuits, and over a century of controversy. It had endured everything thrown at it. But now, for the first time, something stronger than violence threatened its existence. Truth. Truth about what the prison had become. Truth about what had been hidden. And truth about why California could no longer pretend San Quentin was just another aging facility. The walls were finally speaking, and their story was only beginning to unfold. While investigators uncovered the structural failures of San Quentin, another truth emerged, one far more difficult to measure. The prison's decay had a human cost, paid slowly, silently, and over generations. Inside those aging walls lived men who had spent decades adapting to a world that no longer existed. Some were elderly, walking with canes, their bodies worn down by years of concrete floors and inadequate medical care. Others carried the mental scars of isolation, crowding, violence, and constant tension. San Quentin wasn't built for healing. It was built for containment. But over time, containment turned into something harsher, a kind of slow erosion that wore down the mind just as easily as it wore down the body. Medical professionals began to speak more openly about the conditions they had worked in. They described patients who waited hours just to be seen, not because of negligence, but because the facilities simply couldn't support the population. They described equipment that barely functioned, hallways too narrow to move stretchers, and cell blocks where airflow was so poor that treating respiratory illness was nearly impossible. Some prisoners, especially those who had spent decades inside, said the environment aged them twice as fast. They talked about summers where the heat inside the cells felt suffocating, winters where the drafts kept them shivering all night, and nights when sleep was impossible because the walls echoed with noise and the threat of violence. But the hardest stories came from men who tried to improve themselves. Those who enrolled in rehabilitation programs found their classes cancelled because rooms were unusable. Those who sought therapy or counselling often had to wait weeks due to understaffing. And those hoping to reconnect with family faced strict visitation limitations caused by outdated infrastructure and chronic staffing shortages. San Quentin had become a place where progress was nearly impossible, not because inmates didn't want it, but because the prison itself could not support it. Then came the staff perspective. For decades, officers had worked in an environment that was dangerous not only because of inmates, but because of the prison's age. Broken gates, failing surveillance cameras, lighting that flickered on and off. They walked tiers knowing that equipment failure could place them at risk as much as any confrontation. Many guards admitted privately that San Quentin's closure was overdue. They had seen too much, lived through too much, and knew the prison could not continue without a tragedy repeating itself. The human toll extended beyond its walls. Families who visited loved ones drove to a facility described as deteriorating, unsafe, and unsanitary. Advocacy groups pushed for change not just because inmates deserved better, but because the conditions reflected a system failing on every level. San Quentin wasn't collapsing because of one crisis or one decision. It was collapsing because the people inside, both inmates and staff, had been fighting against the building itself for decades. And as California planned its transformation, one truth became undeniable. San Quentin didn't need repair. It needed rebirth. A complete reimagining of what incarceration could look like. A clean break from a past built on punishment, overcrowding, and decay. But closing a prison with a 170-year history wouldn't be simple. The next phase would reveal just how complex, political, and deeply emotional the process would become.